Pete, did you used to watch the TV show Cops?
You know, I watched a little bit of it. I'm sure everybody's seen a little bit of it. But once you've seen a guy take his shirt off and jump a fence and run through somebody's backyard, you've basically seen Cops. So yeah, I've seen it, and it's part of the grammar, I think, actually, of nonfiction storytelling. It was one of the early reality shows, actually. That, and I think The Real World, maybe. And yeah, of course, everybody brings up Cops when they hear about our project. So.
Sure, but from the few times that you did watch Cops
Yep.
to now spending, what is it, 2.5 years with the Oakland
Almost
Police?
3 years.
Almost 3 years, okay, and doing probably ride-alongs. How do you see Cops, which is sort of this glorified but also haha look at this kind of thing, when it's really you've been on ride-alongs, you've had your life basically on the line, filming?
You know, one of the things that we try to articulate when we're trying to get access, because a big part of nonfiction filmmaking is about access. You can't write these stories, you have to document them, and in order to document them, particularly in an institution, you got to get in there. And part of the pitch is to say that we're not just going to drop in, parachute out, find the most dramatic moments and exploit them, and sort of distort the reality of the context in which that really gives this place a meaning. So if you think about policing in America, it's not the most dramatic moments that are the most meaningful, it's the context around those moments. And the only way that you can get to that is by really committing to time and doing that long, deep dive into, what does it mean, when you see these cops dealing with violence, or domestic violence, you see a cop chasing somebody who's robbed a store, a young African American kid. Who is that kid? Where does that kid come from? Did that kid graduate high school? Though that context for us is everything. And so where Cops ends, we begin, basically. I mean, there is action in the movie. It's not, there's quite a bit of action in it, actually. But we also take a deeper dive in trying to help you understand, and unpack in its full 3 dimensions these men and women who really are being, maligned and criticized, rightfully so, in our society for being detached from, the consequences and accountability of their actions. And so I think that was part of the sort of impetus for making the film in the first place.
So I know it's part of a trilogy, and you've yet to make the 3rd one. But what was the driving force? Well, no pun intended, but to make the force. What was the main day that you just looked at the story of what was going on with the Oakland Police Department? I think in 2013, right?
Yeah.
So there was a different story at that time, and I know things have evolved. But what was the reason at that time?
Well, when we came off of our first film, The Waiting Room, which was the first in a trilogy of films looking at the relationship between public institutions and community in one American city, Oakland, California, I was sitting for breakfast with my executive producer, John Else, who also I studied with in film school. He was my mentor, and he sort of taught me everything I know about, much of what I know about documentary film. And he was saying, hey, we should take a look at the police department here. There hadn't been a major American documentary set inside a urban police department probably since the police tapes, Alan and Susan Raymond's film set in New York. And I mean, there've been a lot of reality shows, Cops and so forth, First 48 and all these reality shows, but like a real deep dive into an American police department hadn't been made in quite some time. And it was at a moment when there were so many questions about the culture and the institution itself, and how it intersected with the matters of race and justice, and so this was also a police department that was in an active process of reform. They had been forced to reform due to a civil rights case in 2000, the Riders case, which was these cops were going out at night, violating people's civil rights, planting drugs, harassing them, beating them in some cases, and that resulted in a negotiated settlement agreement that required them to change. And so we picked up with them just as they were getting ready to complete all the requirements of reform.
They were in what, like the 12th of the
Yeah,
13
like
years?
when we started that, they were in their 12th year, and the chief, Sean Went, who you see in the film, he was brought in to basically close the deal. Like, all right, we're almost done. There's a couple more things here. One of them was racial profiling that we need to get a handle on, and he was brought in to do that.
So how did you contact the Oakland Police Department? I mean, I know Jonna Watson in the film talks about working with you, but initially you were turned down?
Yeah, well, we weren't turned down per se, but we definitely didn't make the ask right away with Jonna, you know, because once you make that ask, that's it. Like, once you make the ask, it's easy to say no. You know, so what you like to do when you're trying to get access to institutions, I teach this to students all the time, is you know, really sort of start to build support around the periphery of that institution. Find people who, you know, understand what you're trying to do, who you know are supporters, who can start telling that narrative. So when the time comes to make that ask, and those people start talking, and you know who these guys are, you know, there's already a foundation of support. And so when the waiting room came out, it was it kind of came out of nowhere. You know, it got shortlisted for an Academy Award, it won a Spirit Award, it was, you know, nominated for a Gotham, and it was really kind of a pride of the city. And so the mayor brought me as a guest at the State of the City address, and she's introduced me and said, these are the type of artists that we need to support. And the U.S. Attorney for Northern California was there, Melinda Haig, and she had seen the film, and she was a huge supporter, and she was like, what are you doing next? And I said, I'd like to try to get into the police department, but I'm not sure how I would do that. And so she said, well, let me see if I can help. You know, so people like that, you know, we started telling our story, like, this is what we want to do, this is our intent. And we were nervous because you weren't just trying to get into a police department, it was a police department that was under federal watch. And so we were thinking, oh man, we got to get like Obama has to sign off on it, like how deep is this going to go, you know? And we weren't really sure. So, but we a lot of it was the waiting room, how well that film did, how much the community loved that film, how much they valued what that added, you know, to the national conversation around access to healthcare. And I think that played a pretty significant role.
So when you were planning the film, I understand that you prefer verite style instead of like the talking head sort of documentaries. Were you concerned for your own safety? Had you ever seen anyone shot or stabbed in your own life, like out, you know, traveling in the Bay Area?
You know, I've been around some pretty hairy situations, you know, and part of my story, you know, was intersecting with law enforcement when I was in college. You know, I got in trouble, I got arrested, and I ended up serving a year in prison on a drug charge. And so, but I didn't have the experience that a lot of young African Americans have. And I don't know if it's because I'm a mixed race, I'm lighter skinned, the way I dress, the way I talk, the way I carry myself, I'm not really sure. But the first, you know, memorable experience I had with law enforcement was them basically saving my life by intersecting me at a very sort of, where I could have gone either way, you know, where I could have gone either way. But when I was in prison, you know, first day I was in prison, somebody got their throat cut, you know, and I was around young black men just like me, but from the other side of the tracks. And so I had a very unique kind of coming of age. This was when I was in 21. This was, you know, right at that moment where you're starting to sort of come into your identity. And but I did grow up in the suburbs of Boston, and I went to private school, I went to Howard University. And so I've always carried with me these diverse experiences in my storytelling. But the reality is that these cops, what I experienced is just a fraction of what people who grow up in places like Oakland or West Baltimore or the Bronx experience on a day-to-day basis, every day, all day, surrounded by poverty, violence, crime, where it's just sort of par for the course to see a friend shot down in front of you. And I was just having a conversation with one of the cop who appears in the film, Captain Armstrong, and, you know, who lost his brother when he was 13. You know, and so these were, so he's from Oakland, you know, so these are experiences that the average person just doesn't have any conception of. And so when I was out with the officers, I'm wearing body armor, they're wearing body armor. This is the environment that you're working in. You know, this is their job. I'm a filmmaker. My job is to document. But immediately in that space, I'm thrust into their point of view in a very visceral way, because I'm feeling, on some level, the same feeling that they are, maybe even elevated, because I don't have a weapon. You know, I have nothing to protect myself other than them. You know, so it really shifted. You know, as someone who's aggressively open-minded, and I went into this process not wanting to, you know, go after the police and try to, like, you know, muckrake and find bad stuff, you know, in the department. But I also went in there really guarding against getting too close to them emotionally and being too sympathetic with them, because I understood that this was a moment when people had a lot of anger, rightfully so, and distrust toward the police, and wanted the truth to be told about what was happening in our police department. And so my job as a documentarian was to try to capture, as close as I could, the truth of what was happening in this environment.
Speaking of which, you talk about being open-minded, and most people from the Bay Area would probably consider themselves that way, and I know there's a very progressive mindset there. But you say people saw you get out of the police car with the camera, and somehow you were trolled on Twitter, and I was just wondering if you could talk about being a filmmaker, trying to make something, and what were they saying to you?
Well, it's difficult. You know, and I'm trying to, you know, I try to reconcile this. My experience, it was flipped. Because what happened was, the people who were being open and transparent and welcoming of me were the cops. And the people that were being aggressive and prejudiced and hurtful toward me were the progressives, many of whom were my friends. So I was, you know, but my friends understood. They knew me, they knew my story, and so when I would see them, it was like an odd sort of cognitive dissonance. I'm getting out the police car, they're there protesting the police. I think they understood what I was trying to do. A lot of people did not even attempt to understand what I was doing. They never spoke to me, they never asked me questions, they were taking my picture, they were trying to spin a narrative on social media about I was an agent for propaganda for the police department. And that was incredibly frustrating for me, you know, and I had to constantly sort of challenge myself to not slip into a mindset of being resentful of that. You know, I think there's still, I think I was impacted by it in ways that will have always changed me, and but one of the things that I know, because I know a lot of people in whatever you want to call it, Black Lives Matter, the protest movement, who are fighting for social justice, and that's a value that I hold very close to my heart because of my personal experience where I come from. My dad went to school with Martin Luther King. I grew up in the civil rights. You know, I was born in 1968, and so. But you work harder to understand people when you know them, when you have a connection to them. And I think that's something that we've lost in this country, is the ability to, oftentimes when we're upset with each other, we're upset with people that we don't really know who they are. And I think that's certainly the case with cops. And the only experience a lot of African Americans have is being profiled by a cop, or being talked down to by a cop, or being harassed by a cop. And that, you just carry that with you. And so we as filmmakers, we had a really tricky, particularly as a black filmmaker, I had a very tricky job, which is to somehow thread the needle and respect that reality, while also trying to hold the truth of these officers in a meaningful way, because they see themselves much differently than the public sees them. They see themselves as protecting black lives every day. You know, so it's a really profound, you know, gulf that we find ourselves in terms of, you know, where people are and how people see each other. And we were capturing that. That's what we were sort of in the process of capturing.
How did you get permission to go on these ride-alongs? Because that footage is so valuable.
Yeah.
How did you get access to that part?
We just asked. We definitely, like we said, we want to understand what it's like to be a cop, and you know a lot of what being a cop is just responding to the radio call. You know, like and because there's so many radio calls, it's shocking that the volume of 911 calls that this department gets, and it's only 750 officers in a city of 500,000 people. So we definitely wanted to get that sense, that visceral sense of you know, the officers just doing their job. They're sort of in. It's a little bit more like the waiting room of you know, minus the politics. You know, what's an average day like? You know, what does an average day look like to you? And so the only way you're going to get that is by getting inside that car and just and following them, going call to call to call. So we did quite a bit of that. Initially, though, it was like all protests, because like we started filming right around the time that you know, the decision was made not to indict Darren Wilson in the shooting of Michael Brown. So that sparked weeks of protest in Oakland, and so that's all we were filming for the first several weeks.
So you talked about some of the response from the activist community toward you on social media. I just wanted to read something that I saw on the Force IMDb page. And a woman had reviewed the film, and she said, "While I do believe that Nix allows the OPD to display their good side, he did not let them hide their dirt either. When emotions run high, it's difficult to stand back and show both sides fairly, but I think he did just that."
Mm-hmm. You know, that was our intent, and I think that, you know, some people cannot. It's remarkable, because the film is a really devastating indictment of this department and of the sort of what's broken within the institution, the moral failure that ultimately occurred at this department. And I told them going in, I said, you know, I'm going to be fair to you, but I'm also going to tell the story that I see, that I experience, that I witness. And you know, humanizing someone doesn't mean necessarily making them look good. It means revealing them in their full 3 dimensions, and that's what we do. Like, you know, that's the whole value proposition of Openhood, is to sort of get to that authenticity through visceral observational storytelling. And but the funny thing is, like, you know, we've screened this thing to lots of audiences and different types of people, and some people still take issue with still perceive the film as a pro-cop film. And that's because the anger and the distrust and the pain that people are carrying is so deep that any step toward showing a cop in a positive light is seen as some degree or some shade of propaganda. And you know, there is a spectrum of sort of resistance to the police in this country that ranges from the sort of all lives matter pro-cop people to abolitionists who believe that we should remove all police from our communities and replace it with a completely new paradigm and model for community and public safety. And so I think woven through that is some degree of performance that bubbles up, and it's very difficult sometimes to like in other words, no moderation. It's whose side are you on? Define your values, articulate those values without compromise. And I think when you know, you have a balanced, a fair and balanced approach, that is perceived as a compromise by many. And so we've had to respond to that, and that has come out in some of the reviews of the film. Not many of the reviews reflect the comment that you've just read there, but there have been some that have been more critical of the balanced approach. Like, this doesn't require a balanced approach. This requires incisive, you know, an incisive takedown. And so that's something that it's just a reality. It's just a reality right now in our sort of public consciousness around this issue.
I think the beginning of the film is much different from the middle of the film and toward the end, when, for me, it felt like a punch in the gut. So I saw it going one way, and I was drawn in, but for me, and this is just my experience, didn't see it in that way. Knowing that you started out with one intention for the film, and then things changed, and without, I guess, giving away too much, How was that? Because it was a drastic turn of events.
Well, narratively, it was an incredibly challenging film to put together in the edit room, and we had many meetings. And our model is an interesting sort of model. Like, I'm the director, I also shoot, and then I have a producer, Linda Davis, and then my editor also does sound. So Lawrence LaRue and he's also a producer, and so that's our team primarily. And then John Else, who's the executive producer, he also did some shooting, and John's a sort of legendary documentary photographer and director. And then we had Sean Havey, who's our associate producer, and he's kind of a jack of all trades, kind of fixer, problem solver. So it was a very small team, and we made the film sort of like, we shot the film consecutive with editing the film. So we were shooting, we'd shoot. If we had a day down shooting, we'd start putting stuff together. And as we went, everything was starting to change in the country. Black Lives Matter was emerging. It was becoming much more difficult for us to imagine a film coming out that was sympathetic toward the police. Not that that was our intent, but what we were observing early on was a lot of success at that department. A lot of the reforms were working. They were making progress. It was the department was a model for reform. And in our minds, we were thinking, how is this film going to sit when at the same time, this is what we're seeing all these incidences on our Facebook feeds, Eric Gardner and Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, like all these things were happening one after the other. And we were really worried, actually, like that we were going to appear to be tone deaf. And so we constantly were asking ourselves, what are we doing? How are we framing the story? It was we cut a lot of versions of this film. At one point I tried narrating the film myself from the perspective of a black person who's trying to make a film that impacts the African American community. And in the end we decided on the approach that we did, which was a 2-year window into a department attempting to reform at this moment in time, which was a seminal moment in the history of policing, but also probably the most dramatic moment in the history of the OPD. Like no question about that. And the film is a result of that framing. And, this is a 2-year journey, and it involves lots of twists and turns. The last, which is particularly dramatic and did feel like a punch in the gut to us as well, because it just came out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere, and so that's how we rendered it in the film. It's a sharp turn in the film, but that's exactly how we experienced it.
I thought it was effective too, how you had the headlines of these various publications about the different turns, and I thought that was just a way to sort of just let it be and show it without any. I mean, these were real headlines, and I just thought that was very effective.
Yeah, and we made that choice because we didn't want to try to interpret and editorialize what was happening, but there was a whole group of journalists and investigative reporters who were tracking this thing and trying to make sense of it. And so that was how the public was experiencing it. That's how we were experiencing it, and we wanted to sort of it also allowed us to add a little bit of context to the material to sort of ground the audience a little bit better.
How long was the typical filming day, and what were you choosing to film, and what were you choosing to leave out?
It changed. Like in the beginning, it was protests. Some days we were out there 12, 14. It depend on who we were following. We were kind of casting in the beginning, trying to find officers who we would follow, for the whole film. One of the original central questions of the film was who becomes a cop and why, and how does the job change you? So we were, just hanging out with lots of different people, but the doctors. I mean, cops like doctors. It never stops, right? So they tend to go on like 12-hour shifts, and so that was fairly typical. That we'd just be out, and some nights were just like slow and boring, and then other nights were just like bang, 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 bang. We're like 12. You would go by and you'd have hours of footage in the camera, and you couldn't believe it that amount of time had elapsed, and that was more the rule than the exception. And we were in lots of different environments, from doing ride-alongs. We did, the most painful thing were the city council hearings, because we were just like, that was like, I grew up in the black church, so I'm used to but it's like people testifying, like getting up there, like long lines of community voicing their concerns about the issues. And we would tend to go to these city council meetings when a policing issue was on the docket. We'd go to see where's the community at on this, and how is the chief going to respond, or how is the mayor going to respond. And we were trying to build this sort of an environment and a lot of that material ended up not making it into the film. When everything changed in the end, we had to recut the whole film, but we filmed tons of that stuff. Boring as hell. And then we also a lot of press conferences. But these are the pieces that you have to gather, all the pieces to ultimately to sort of have options, because they're all building blocks for the story.
We've seen some behind-the-scenes footage of you filming with quite a large camera.
Mm-hmm.
What were you using, or did it vary from time to time?
We were using a Sony F5, which is it's a bit of a cinema camera. A lot of indie filmmakers doing narrative features will use that. It's better for setups where you're putting the camera on a tripod, or on a Steadicam, or on a dolly or something. But it's a really good camera in low light. And we knew we were going to be doing a lot of shooting at night, and so we tested a lot of cameras, and that one performed the best, at least in my opinion. And I shoot my own film, so I'm very kind of particular about that. And then we shot on a Sony Alpha 7S, which is a small DSLR camera for all the interior car stuff, POV stuff. So we had suction mounts so that you could really sort of be there in the car with these officers as they're speeding through the streets. We wanted to give the audience kind of a visceral feeling of that. And that camera is also extremely good in low light. So those were just kind of a coincidence. They're both Sony cameras. We should have gotten some money from Sony on the film. But I thought the film actually looked great. And I'm a cinematographer, so I was kind of going for, I wanted the film to just be immersive and beautiful. That was part of my goal. And that's very difficult to do when you're on the fly, when you're also trying to capture reality.
Right.
You can't, because you can't stop. You have to sort of kind of have it pre-planned, and serendipity plays a role in that. You have to get lucky sometimes, right? So, yeah.
Did you use any lighting equipment?
No.
No? Wow.
Never, yeah. I don't use lights in any of my work. I use natural light. I look for opportunities to introduce light into the scene. One of the tricks that we used in the interiors was the cops have this laptop that they use for all to track all their calls, and so we would use that as a little fill. Sometimes we'd open it up, and that would cast a little soft glow inside the light. All practical lighting. Sometimes we'd use the dome light, the overhead, but we didn't bring in any of our own lights because you just can't manage that particularly when you're running in a documentary. Anyway, it's hard to do that, but when you're running around with cops, sometimes you're wearing a bulletproof vest. You're in very hairy situations, you have to pick up and go sometimes, and so you can't be having equipment and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how we did it.
So last question, Pete. Coming off the success of your documentary, The Waiting Room, how did you want to build on that with The Force?
Yeah, so with The Waiting Room, one of the things that was exciting about The Waiting Room was creating this immersive experience for people, trying to really immerse them in a world without, in verite. We actually had a little bit of voiceover that we used in the film, and but it was confined, for the most part, to this hospital waiting room. Everything was in close up. It was very almost intimate and confined in this interior space. Whereas with the police movie, I felt man, we can break out and we can see the city, get more visual. And as a cinematographer, that's just incredibly exciting to be able to sort of break out of that claustrophobic kind of feeling, even though it was really effective, for the waiting room, that claustrophobic feeling, because that's what it feels like to be in a hospital and feeling in a waiting room. this film gave me the opportunity to really kind of stretch out and sort of, get visual with the film, and that for me is something that, excites me. And also, we made the decision that we were not going to have any voiceover, that was going to be pure, cinema verite. And we had a little bit of text cards in the beginning just to contextualize it in the news articles, but everything else was direct cinema. And for me, for my money, that creates the most visceral experience that in my mind really gets you closer to a truth. Even though that may result in some ambiguity, it creates that feeling of closeness and authenticity that I think gives the audience a thrill. When there's action and when there's emotion, it just draws the emotion out deeper than there are different styles that are appropriate for different subject matters. For my films, that immersion, that closeness, that authenticity is really key to the story.